And it's not that he was throwing fits and kicking over C-stands and, throwing boxes around or anything.
When Hollywood's golden mask began to break, Ron Howard had always been the quiet center in a world built on noise, the kind of director who believed in dignity, restraint, and the simple power of being kind. But the moment someone asked him about Hollywood's darker heartbeat, the part the public never sees, something shifted inside him. His face tightened, as if old memories had suddenly returned, uninvited and unwelcome. "You wouldn't believe what those legends did when the cameras stopped," he once whispered, almost as if the truth itself could still hurt him. To Howard, the so-called golden age of Hollywood was never truly golden. Behind the glamour, it was a world stitched together with silence, cruelty, and a hierarchy where fame excused everything. The same icons who built America's dreams also shattered countless lives behind closed doors, and the industry let them. And now, after decades of carrying those shadows privately, Ron Howard has decided to speak their names out loud. If you enjoy stories from the past that still speak to us today, I'd love to have you here. Please like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Screen Icons. Your support helps keep these memories alive. Errol Flynn, the charm that hid a devil. Before James Bond, before Jack Sparrow, Hollywood already had its original swashbuckling rogue. Flynn wasn't just charming on screen. He embodied danger, reckless desire, and the raw magnetism that made audiences believe he could get away with anything. In the 1,930 seconds, when he arrived from Tasmania and exploded into fame with Captain Blood, 1,935, the studios built an empire on the back of his charisma. But behind that polished image stood a man unraveling. Arrogance, addiction, and entitlement wrapped around him like a second skin. And by 1942, all illusions shattered. His reputation turned poisonous when two teenage girls, Peggy Satterlee and Betty Hansen, accused him of statutory rape. Overnight, the trial became front-page news. America was split in half, those who worshipped the screen idol and those who finally saw the darkness behind him. Flynn didn't shrink from the courtroom. He laughed through testimony, smirking as if the charges were an inconvenience rather than a threat. Warner Brothers hired elite lawyers, the best they could find at the time. Fans camped outside the courthouse for days, and according to reports then, studio executives moved quietly behind the scenes, making witnesses disappear. Flynn was acquitted, but the acquittal didn't clean him, it unleashed him. When private letters surfaced in 1978, decades after the trial, the world saw his true voice. Flynn bragged about his conquests, wrote cruel jokes about the women who feared him, and mocked the very pain he had caused. The myth of the irresistible swashbuckler collided with the reality of a man who viewed life as something to take, never to give. Ron Howard later said that reading about Flynn's trial was a turning point for him. "A moment when I realized Hollywood could protect monsters," he recalled, as long as they smiled for the camera. To the public, Flynn remained a rogue hero. To insiders, he was a warning, the earliest example of how excess, power, and indulgence could rot a man from the inside out. Alcohol consumed him. Cocaine sharpened his downfall. Financial ruin closed in. By 1959, at just 50, his body gave out in Vancouver after years of abuse, a collapse that felt inevitable to everyone who had watched the spiral. The autopsy listed heart failure, cirrhosis, and stomach ulcers. But Howard saw something deeper. He died the same way he lived, Howard said, taking everything and giving nothing. In the end, Flynn's life became Hollywood's blueprint for moral decay, a reminder that charm can hide cruelty, and that fame, no matter how bright, never absolves the darkness underneath. Kirk Douglas, rage woven into a legend. To Ron Howard, Douglas embodied the greatest contradiction of Hollywood's golden age. A performer who preached honor, justice, and bravery on screen, while off screen, he carried a storm that could shake entire sets. Born Izer Danielovich in 1916 to impoverished immigrant parents, Douglas clawed his way out of hardship with sheer willpower and an almost ferocious hunger for success. By the time Spartacus crowned him an international icon, he had achieved everything Hollywood promised: fame, wealth, admiration, but those who worked with him remembered a far darker force, a temper that never rested. Crew members described him as impossible to satisfy, a man whose anger could ignite without warning and leave people trembling or in tears. His charisma was undeniable, but so was the volatility that followed him everywhere. Actress Deborah Paget once remarked that Douglas didn't merely want to dominate a scene, he wanted to dominate every soul standing in it. Howard, who studied Douglas' performances as a young filmmaker, later admitted, "There's a kind of rage under that smile, the kind that eats a person alive, and that rage didn't fade with time. It shadowed him across decades." For years, whispers about his behavior toward women circulated quietly through Hollywood. Biographers and insiders have long pointed to his alleged involvement in the 1,950 seconds assault of rising actress Natalie Wood when she was just 16, a claim that resurfaced only after her death and was repeated by her sister Lana in a 2018 memoir. Douglas was never charged, and the story was absorbed into the same machinery of silence that Hollywood had used to protect so many powerful men of his era. Even after his death in 2020, at the age of 103, the controversy did not vanish. It returned not as rumor, but as a cultural reckoning, the overdue confrontation with a history long ignored. On film sets, Douglas' presence could inspire and terrify in equal measure. Stanley Kubrick, who directed him twice, called him the most driven man I've ever met and the hardest to control. Ron Howard later reflected that Douglas' legacy was not only about talent or ambition, but about something more dangerous: unchecked power. He believed the rules didn't apply to him, Howard said, and Hollywood agreed. When Douglas accepted his honorary Oscar in 1996, many saw an aging legend reaching for peace. But to Howard, it looked different. The final act of a performer who had spent a lifetime outrunning his own demons. Beneath the applause lay a truth the industry never wanted to confront: that some of its brightest legends built their legacies not on brilliance alone, but on fear. Faye Dunaway, beauty forged into cruelty. If Errol Flynn represented corruption and Kirk Douglas embodied unrestrained fury, then Dunaway stood for something colder, sharper, and far more unsettling: cruelty wrapped in beauty. To Ron Howard, she was the proof that darkness in Hollywood didn't always come with violence. Sometimes it arrived in the form of control, humiliation, and an ego so vast it eclipsed every person around her. Born in 1,941 inches, Bascom, Florida, Dunaway's rise wasn't just fast, it was explosive. Bonnie and Clyde, 1,967. Chinatown, 1,974. Film after film cemented her as an untouchable goddess of the screen, icy, magnetic, almost supernatural in her presence. But behind that brilliance, whispers followed her everywhere. Crew members spoke about her tantrums, her relentless demands, and the way she reportedly treated assistants as if they were disposable tools rather than human beings. Her Mommy Dearest co-star, Rutanya Alda, once said, "You could feel the fear on set. Everyone was waiting for her to explode." A film intended to portray abuse ended up reflecting the atmosphere around Dunaway herself. In a twist of irony, while portraying Joan Crawford, a woman infamous for cruelty, Dunaway was, according to many accounts, mirroring that very behavior behind the scenes. Director Frank Perry later admitted that he considered quitting altogether because of her outbursts. She reportedly threw objects, screamed at makeup artists, and refused to film unless the lighting made her appear divine. Ron Howard would eventually reference her as an example of what happens when an actor's hunger for control mutates into something closer to emotional terror. And the stories kept coming. During The Wicked Lady, Dunaway allegedly slapped a cameraman and spat on a crew member. On Don Juan DeMarco, she was said to have humiliated assistants so intensely that production halted for an entire day. Her former manager, Jay Bernstein, summed it up brutally. Faye doesn't just play divas, she becomes them. By the 2000s, the industry's patience ran out. Hollywood stopped calling. Directors refused to work with her, labeling her unmanageable. In 2011, after she was fired from a Broadway revival of Tea at 5, Dunaway blamed everyone but herself. The controversy didn't fade. It settled into her legacy like a shadow. When a journalist later asked Ron Howard about her career, he answered politely, but the meaning was unmistakable. She chased perfection so hard she forgot compassion. Her downfall wasn't sudden. It was a slow unraveling, thread by thread, until the woman who once conquered Hollywood found herself isolated, avoided even at retrospectives celebrating her own films. To Howard, she became a symbol of a brutal truth. That talent without empathy eventually turns inward and destroys itself. John Wayne, America's icon with a darkened heart. In Hollywood, power without grace doesn't stay power, it turns to poison. And no figure captured that truth more clearly than John Wayne, the tyrant of the West. Few stars ever towered over the industry the way Wayne did. To millions of Americans, he was America, the fearless cowboy, the patriot, the soldier, the embodiment of rugged masculinity. Children idolized him. Politicians quoted him. Entire generations shaped their idea of manhood around his image. But to Ron Howard, who grew up watching Wayne on a flickering black and white TV, the truth behind that heroic silhouette was far darker. When I learned what he was really like, Howard reflected, I stopped seeing the hero. I saw the bully who wore his country like a costume. Born Marion Morrison in 1907 inches, Iowa, Wayne rose through the studio system by leaning into a myth. The myth of unbreakable manhood, of certainty, of domination. By the 1950 seconds, he wasn't just an actor anymore. He had become an ideology. Wayne saw dissent as weakness, progress as betrayal. On set, he ruled not with talent, but with intimidation. Technicians who failed to meet his expectations were cursed out publicly. No one was spared. Fellow actor Christopher Mitchum once said, "When Duke was angry, the air froze. You either agreed with him or you disappeared." Howard later described that environment as the opposite of art. It's fear, he said. Fear pretending to be discipline. And Wayne's cruelty didn't stop when the director yelled, "Cut." He belittled women in public, mocked indigenous actors on Western sets, and dismissed black performers who challenged the stereotypes he helped create. Then came the infamous 1971 Playboy interview, still considered one of the most disturbing documents of Hollywood's golden age. In that conversation, Wayne claimed Native Americans were selfishly holding land, argued that Black Americans were not yet responsible enough for self-governance, and insisted that films needed real men, not whiners. Those statements resurfaced decades later, igniting outrage and revealing not a patriot, but a man trapped in hatred. Even his artistry carried that darkness. On the set of The Searchers, Wayne clashed fiercely with director John Ford over his insistence on playing Ethan Edwards, a racist, vengeful Confederate, as a sympathetic figure. Ford resisted. Wayne refused. In the final cut, Edwards' cruelty bleeds through the frame, and so does Wayne's own contempt. Ron Howard, who studied the performance at USC, said, "It's terrifying because you can't tell where the role ends and the man begins." Even in his final years, weakened by cancer, Wayne never apologized, never reconsidered his views. He brushed off critics as soft, blaming changing culture for his growing isolation. He died in 1979 at the age of 72, still hailed by millions as an American icon. But to filmmakers like Ron Howard, his life became a warning written across Hollywood history. Power built on prejudice doesn't mature into wisdom, it curdles into bitterness. Roman Polanski, When Genius Walked Hand in Hand with Darkness. "The myth survived," Ron Howard once said, "but the man behind it never deserved the legend." Roman Polanski, the exile of shame. For Howard, Polanski represented the one truth Hollywood never wanted to confront: that brilliance can exist alongside darkness, and sometimes brilliance becomes the excuse that hides it. "I admired his films before I knew who he really was," Howard admitted. "Then I realized talent doesn't absolve a person. Sometimes it hides them." Polanski's rise was meteoric. Born in 1933 inches Paris to Polish parents and a survivor of the Nazi occupation, his life had been marked by tragedy long before fame arrived. His early films, Knife in the Water, Rosemary's Baby, transformed him into a visionary. Critics called him a genius who could turn paranoia into poetry. The world praised him as a filmmaker, touched by brilliance and haunted by ghosts. But the darkness inside his movies wasn't fiction. It was a reflection. In March 1977, the illusion shattered. Polanski was arrested for the sexual assault of 3-year-old Samantha Gailey after a photo shoot at Jack Nicholson's Los Angeles home. The evidence was overwhelming. Polanski pled guilty to unlawful sex with a minor. Before sentencing, he fled the United States, escaping to France, where he remained, never returning. And in that moment, Hollywood split in two. Some condemned him. Others defended him as a troubled artist. For Howard, then a young filmmaker learning what integrity meant, the reaction was devastating. "They spoke of art while a child's life was broken," he said years later. "That was the moment I realized how deep the hypocrisy ran." Polanski's exile became one of Hollywood's enduring moral stains. He continued directing abroad, and in 2003, he even won an Oscar for The Pianist. Howard described watching that moment from afar as both surreal and sickening. As the audience at the Dolby Theater rose in applause, Howard could not bring himself to stand. "I thought of that girl," he recalled, 13 years old, alone, and I wondered what applause must sound like to her. Even decades later, the industry's willingness to separate genius from guilt infuriated him. When Polanski won Francis César Award in 2020, protesters stormed out in anger. To Howard, that moment symbolized justice arriving late, painfully late, but not too late. "It took the world 40 years, he said, to say what should have been said the next day. A monster doesn't become less monstrous just because he can frame a shot." Speaking to Vanity Fair in 2021, Howard reflected on Polanski's continued freedom. "He lives in Europe, untouchable, but permanently followed by the shadow of what he did. His name no longer evokes genius, only contradiction, brilliance and disgrace bound together." For Howard, Polanski's story reveals everything that poisoned the Golden Age, a system that protects the artist and abandons the victim, a world where applause can drown out screams, and a truth Hollywood still refuses to accept. "Hollywood forgives anything," Howard said bitterly, "as long as the lighting is good." Mickey Rooney, the laughter that concealed a ruined soul. If Roman Polanski symbolized Hollywood's hypocrisy, then Mickey Rooney embodied its most seductive illusion, the belief that charm could erase cruelty. For Ron Howard, who grew up watching Rooney's cheerful late-night musicals on television, discovering the truth behind that sparkling grin was nothing short of heartbreaking. "He was the face of joy," Howard once said. But behind that smile was misery, and worse, he spread it. Born Joseph Yule Jr. in 1920, Rooney became Hollywood's first true child superstar. By 18, he was the highest-paid actor in America. MGM built entire franchises around his grin, the unstoppable all-American boy, singing and dancing his way into the hearts of the nation. But fame that enormous, delivered that young, warped him almost instantly. He married 8 times, cheated repeatedly, gambled away fortunes, and humiliated those who loved him most. Ava Gardner, one of his ex-wives, once described him as the shortest man with the biggest ego in the world. Behind closed doors, the darkness only deepened. In 2011, His eighth wife, Jan Chamberlain, and her son were accused of elder abuse and financial manipulation, allegations involving the draining of Rooney's accounts and isolating him from his own family. But decades before that scandal, the harm Rooney inflicted had already become part of Hollywood folklore. Former co-stars called him volatile, cruel, unpredictable. Judy Garland, his closest friend during their MGM years, once said privately, "He could make you laugh one moment and destroy you the next." Garland, pushed to exhaustion by studio heads and emotionally broken for years, later hinted that Rooney, not just the executives, shared responsibility for her suffering. By the 1,960 seconds, the golden boy had fallen. Addiction, bankruptcy, and scandal shadowed every step he took. In a 1979 interview, Rooney said, "I've lived 1,000 lives," but as Ron Howard later reflected, he lived every one of them for himself. Even in old age, Rooney's bitterness never softened. He blamed everyone, studios, wives, fate, even God, for his collapse, but never himself. When he died in 2014 at 93, his estate was worth less than $20,000. His body went unclaimed until friends raised enough money to give him a modest burial in Los Angeles. For Howard, Rooney's story was the final piece of a pattern, the truth behind the Golden Age's carefully painted mask. "He made the world laugh while he was dying inside," Howard said. And maybe that's the saddest evil of all, when pain turns into performance and nobody notices. To Howard, these stories were not revenge, they were warnings. Reminders that Hollywood's golden age was never golden at all, but built on silence, exploitation, and lives crushed in the shadows of fame. And as he once said, the scariest monsters aren't in horror films. They're the ones the spotlight protects. So tell me, which of these 6 actors shocked you the most? The predator, the tyrant, or the man whose smile never told the truth? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I'm listening. If you enjoy stories from the past that still speak to us today, I'd love to have you here. Please like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Screen Icons. Your support helps keep these memories alive.